Evolution, Part 2. Let's talk about biogeography. Biogeography is the study of the geographic distribution of life forms on Earth, and we can look at where we find populations of animals, and that can help confirm what we know about plate tectonics and movement. Biogeographical evidence, basically similar species and similar habitats performing the same natural history and occupying the same niche. So we look at distributions and see if they are consistent with the hypothesis that different forms of life or related forms of life evolved in one locale then spread to accessible regions. So these populations spread, then plate tectonics move apart, and this is how we get similar animals in different areas. Okay, now the geography does play a role, because if you're at the equator or further away from the equator, either north or south, you're going to have different climates. And as plates move, some are moving north, some are moving south, some are moving east, some are moving west. The climate will change because of that, but it is very gradual, which gives species plenty of time to adapt to the changing climate. Now, Darwin compared South American animals to those which he was familiar with in Europe, and he found this interesting animal called a Patagonian hare or a Patagonian cavy. It's kind of like a guinea pig with long legs, and it basically fulfilled the same ecological niche, and that means the role of rabbits. Okay? Both types of animals were adapted to the same type of environment. They ate the same thing. They hid in the same way. They share common descent with guinea pigs, and there's a lot of different cavies that have split and diverged into multiple species. Here is the Patagonian hare or Patagonian cavy, and these are just as stressed out as rabbits. If you catch a wild rabbit, more than likely, if you find baby rabbits and try to hand raise them, they tend to die. They just can't handle the stress of being captured and handled. Domestic rabbits are different. Well, so are these guys. These guys, you try to catch them and handle them a lot, most of them will die. But for all intents and purposes, this is what a rabbit looks like in South America, because it does the same thing, lives the same way. So our geography has changed over the millions of years that we've been around, hundreds of millions of years. You know, at one point we started out as one giant continent called Pangaea. That broke apart. We had this northern Laurasia and the southern Gondwanaland, and then the major continents split apart, and you can see where Africa, North America, and South America moved apart. They left Europe. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to realize that that little place there is like a crack. And interestingly enough, you can go to Iceland where the two edges of the plates are separating, and there's a little canal there, and it grows by an inch every year as the two plates. Basically, you've got Africa, Europe, Asia is moving 1 inch in that direction to the west every year, while North America and South America, to the east, while North America and South America are moving 1 inch to the west every year. All right. Now, this is just about 5% of the Earth's history. Imagine all of these things sliding away slowly over millions of years. And why do they move? Well, that's pretty easy. It's called plate tectonics. And underneath the crust of the Earth is liquid rock. And deep inside of the Earth, there's a big core of nickel. And that nickel is what actually provides us with our magnetic poles on the planet. Earthquakes and volcanoes are evidence that Earth's plates continue to move today. Pressure builds up, volcanoes blow. Okay, and lava comes out. Earthquakes, when, for instance, in California, there are two plates that are grinding together. That's what makes the Rocky Mountains. And in California, those plates are pretty unstable. And so as they try to slide, and one is sliding over the top of the other, pressure builds up until eventually they give. And when they give, you get earthquakes. Now, here were some animals that Charles Darwin found as fossils. Leftover animals, and they're not alive today. And that's when he first started to question, okay, if everything's created perfect, why are these species not alive today? And why do they look so much like species that are alive today? However, the Glyptodon, imagine this is an armadillo that was like 8 feet long. This is a sloth that was like 12 feet tall. And we find evidence of these being hunted in the Ice Age, probably for food. Notice he has the big claws like regular sloths do. And he was told when he asked, why are these extinct? Well, they probably missed the boat, the ark, when Noah set sail. Just those species weren't saved. So that's one interpretation. This is the biogeography of Australia. Now, Australia separated from everything else a long time ago. And this was during the rise of the mammals. At this point, when we had Laurasia and Gondwanaland, and then Australia's down here, the mammals were small, burrowing, insectivore-type creatures, and they didn't get their chance till the end of the Mesozoic when all the big dinosaurs were taken out by the meteor strike. So then the first mammals, some of these most primitive mammals, there are monotremes, like your buddy, the platypus in Phineas and Ferb. He is an egg-laying mammal, and they don't have nipples to feed milk to their young. They just have little pores. It secretes on their stomachs, and the babies just lick it up. And there's also the spiny echidna or spiny anteater. These are found in Australia, and they also lay eggs. And then you have marsupials. Marsupials, the females have a pouch, and the young are born very, very primitive, and they literally crawl out of the female's uterus and work their way up, get into the pouch, and then they attach to a teat, and the teat swells and locks them into place until they're big enough to kind of fend for themselves a little bit, and then the mother continues to care for them and keeps them in the pouch until such time as they're able to go their own way. Now, the mammals, the marsupials, originated in Australia, and at one time Australia was attached to South America, and so some marsupials moved into South America, and when the two broke apart, the ones in South America, there weren't very many species. So today we do find a few species of South American marsupial, but for the most part, very few. And then when South America and North America hooked up, there's only one species of marsupial in North America, and that is our friend the opossum. Okay. Down here in Australia, we had massive types of radiation. So the adaptation down here, basically modern mammals never evolved in Australia. Instead, the marsupials adapted to all the different niches and became the ecosystem. So this little sugar glider, they pretty much take the role of a flying squirrel. And the kangaroos, the big ones are called euros, the smaller ones are called wallabies. These are like deer. They have the same lifestyle as deer. Okay? Here is an extinct predator called the thylacine, which is very much like a wolf. You have, let's see, this little guy. This is a wombat, and they're very much like our, not muskrats, very much like our groundhogs. Over here, Dasyurus, these are very similar to cats. This is a Tasmanian devil, and these are very much like our wolverines or some of our other mustelids. And the Tasmanian devils are in real problem. They've actually got a virus that spreads cancer, and it's on their face, and it's getting spread from Tasmanian devil to Tasmanian devil because their species interactions, they bite each other in the face for several normal behaviors. It may not seem normal to us, but it's normal to them. And when they do, they spread the virus, and these big, huge tumors grow on their face. And we'll probably see this critter go extinct in the next 50 years, if not sooner. But the point is, all of these animals are homologous or identical to other animals in the sense of the role they play in the ecosystem. And since no modern mammals arose in Australia, these animals didn't have to compete with them and weren't eliminated. Now, there have been some introductions of modern mammals, primarily, the dingoes were introduced by early man, and they have caused a lot of trouble. Rabbits have caused a lot of trouble. The introduction of these more modern mammals have put a lot of these animals into danger, basically. And this shows, okay, so here's Africa and South America, India, Antarctica, etc. And what we can look at fossils because we can map where we think the plates moved to and from based on their direction and things like that. There's also magnetic poles in rocks. So if, let's take Africa, it's pointing north this way, but let's say it started out on its side, and cooling rock from lava, when it cools, the magnetic poles are pointing north, and then this guy moves up, and now in that rock, the little magnetic elements are pointing due west. Okay, so that's one of the ways we look at it. But another is we look at fossils. So if we find, and we've got multiple fossil species that we find in South America and Africa, and they're exact same species. And so that gives us evidence that at one point these two continents were connected. Okay, and this species also has fossils in these other regions. And so that gives us and supports evidence of these things being attached, these plates being attached at some point in the past. And then we use radiometric dating to date the rocks. Now, here is Indonesia. Indonesia is a nation that includes all these, there's like 10,000 islands in Indonesia. All right, here's New Guinea. And when we look at these islands, we go, okay, what islands broke off of what mass of land? And so what we see, we can use biogeography to help give us information. Up on the mainland in Southeast Asia, we have certain species of animals. Down in Australia, we have certain species of animals. And so when we look at like Java, Sumatra, Borneo, things like that, all of their animals resemble all the animals that you would find on the mainland in Asia. When you look here at the Philippines, Sulawesi, New Guinea, it's easy to see where New Guinea came from. You can look at the north here, and it would fit right in that little slot. But all these other islands broke off from Australia, or the animals spread from Australia to islands formed by volcanic activity. Okay, and this is called Wallace's line. And basically, he surveyed all the species out here, and he said, okay, on all these islands, the species somehow got there from the mainland, whether they were on plates that moved or they just migrated to volcanically formed islands, and all of the animals on this side originated in Australia. These are very unique faunal groups, and they're not very similar. Again, that gives us some data. Let's look at some biogeography case studies. The Galápagos Islands, one of the stops that Charles Darwin made, and he looked at finches and he looked at tortoises. And he noticed at some point the tortoise neck length varied from island to island. And he proposed that speciation on islands correlated with differences in vegetation. Now, during the last ice age, the Galapagos, the seas lowered their level, sea level lowered, and the Galapagos Islands were not an island, they were just one big landmass. As the glaciers melted sea levels rose and they became different islands, thus isolating different groups of tortoises that interbred, and then over millions of years, they basically mutated and adapted to their particular islands. Finches, the Galápagos Islands are very far from mainlands. Okay, so a lot of birds from a mainland, the farther the island is from the mainland, the less likely founder stock of a bird species would fly out there and land on those islands. Now we know that a lot of small birds will sometimes get caught up in storm fronts and blown along. They get blown along in front of the storm fronts, and they're not strong enough to fight it, and a lot of them just get blown out to sea and die, but sometimes they will be blown out to an island that's isolated. And so in this case, we found some finches, and they had adapted to all different ways of finding food. All right, because their beak shapes were different. And Darwin observed all these different species, and at that point, he didn't have tools like genetic or genome mapping, but he speculated that they could have descended from a single pair of mainland finch, probably not a single pair, but a small flock. And then over time, as the population rose and resources began to get scarce for that finch, some of the finches would be able to start exploiting a different food source. And that began the beginning of speciation events. And then over time, they basically evolved into multiple species, just like the tortoises. There are different tortoises on every island. And here's a map showing some of the tortoise species. Now, if you ever go to the Galápagos Islands, what you will find is that there is these sharp volcanic rocks that isolate these more lush areas that contain life. And walking across this sharp stuff, I've seen it just because I've been to the Galápagos Islands once. They're owned by Ecuador, and I've seen them just slice into brand new boots and slice open soles. They're like glass, like sharp. Okay, almost like obsidian. And so it's very hard for animals like a tortoise to move from this spot to this population because going over all those rocks would kill it. So they tend to stay in their own little spots. And all these different little islands, I've shown you pictures of all the species. Now, quite a few have become extinct and more are going on the way. Let's see, was that Lonesome George? We just had the last, here's an extinct species. Here's Lonesome George. He was the last tortoise of his species. He was on Pinta Island. They called him Solitaria Jorge. Now, they did get a lot of sperm from him, and they have hybridized him with some other tortoises so that they don't lose his entire genome, but his species will never be a pure species again, unfortunately. Natural selection. This is a pivotal point on evolution, and it's really rather simple. Okay, and you can see this in the development of the beaks in the finches on the Galápagos Islands. Natural selection, for all intents and purposes, says that there's always more animals of a species than there are enough resources to keep them alive. And so these animals are competing within their own species, and they are competing with other species, and that's what the word or term fitness means. It means, are you the most fit? The most fit will be the most successful and have the best chance of leaving their offspring with their genetic makeup to the next generation. Those that are less fit might get eaten, might not find food, might starve to death, might die of disease, etc. And that is just nature. That's what happens. And so looking at these birds, as Darwin did, it occurred to him they might just come from one species because they are so similar in a lot of ways, except for beaks. And this maps the different food strategies that these different finches eat. But now all of this has since been confirmed by genetic or genomic mapping. All right. Natural selection and adaptation. Individuals have heritable variations. That's our genetics, our alleles. And some are more adaptive than others, and some are more successful than others. And we see that even in our own species of humans. Some humans are extremely successful in our society, and some humans are not as successful in dealing with our society. But the skills it takes to survive and be successful today in 2021 is very different than the skills needed to survive in, say, 1701 here in the good old United States or North America. And so we have a huge amount of variation. And the reason that we have, the more variation you have, the less likely a species will go extinct. Because let's say that a really bad pandemic comes along, not COVID, that one wasn't all that bad comparatively. Let's say Ebola zipped through our population in North America and it killed 80% of the people. Well, the other 20% would be able to survive and move forward. Okay, because we have enough genetic variation that this most viral and viral virus can kill a lot of people, but it can't get them all. So there are some genetic makeups and genomes that are able to resist Ebola. Okay. Some of the variations we have functional characteristics, physical, behavioral. The variations occur randomly. They're essential, and they allow you to adapt over time. Fitness is the relative reproductive success of an individual. Adaptations are changes that help a species become more suited to its environment and increases its fitness. So just like today, not everybody gets to find a domestic partner and produce offspring. Now, it might be that some people don't want to, and that's a choice, or it might be that they just are not successful. Now, artificial selection. This looks at how we can change the physical appearance of things in relatively short periods of time. Now, at the time of this writing, we had data that shows about 14,000 years ago is when we first started domesticating the gray wolf. Now there has turned up some more recent information that may have pushed that back to 20,000 years. Okay? Wolves under domestication were separated from other wolves, and they were picked for whatever traits appealed to humans. So if you had a wolf pup that was born and it just wanted to kill everything it saw, that would be the one they would eat. And then you had a wolf pup that seemed to get along with people really well, that's the one you'd keep. Okay, and over many generations, we have selectively chosen for canid individuals that respond positively to humans, to the point now that we have got a genetic group of animals that we call dogs that have a genetic predisposition to want to please their humans. Okay, and so let's look. In just that small amount of time, we've taken this and turned it into all of these. They're all basically Canis familiaris, although many of them can hybridize, especially with coyotes. So there is debate, is Canis familiaris a valid species, or is it just a subspecies of Canis lupus? Okay. We've also done this with plants. Most of our crops, through artificial selection, we have manipulated, and this would be genetic modification, into these different vegetables. All of them came from the wild mustard plant. So when you're looking at genetically modified organisms and people are worried about, oh my gosh, what are they going to do to me? Maybe I shouldn't eat them. You can't eat any of these because they've all been genetically modified. They just weren't modified in a lab. They were modified through artificial selection. Okay. Natural selection, some observations. Genetic variation, limited resources, overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, unequal reproductive success, and descent with modification. So whatever the current conditions are, the offspring that are best suited to survive in those conditions will survive, and the other ones won't. They'll die off. So they're struggling to exist. This ties into Thomas Malthus and his population ecology work that he did. Let's see, we covered that. Let's talk about some case studies here, just a couple quick ones. The Grants, Peter and Rosemary, they looked at ground finches and the beak size and how they adapted to the weather. Now, these ground finches existed in an area that would have wet years and dry years, and it would alternate. And so what they found is the offspring that survived during each year was dependent upon the dry years. So here's how thick the beak is. The thicker the beak is, the easier it is to break open the seeds and get food. And so on dry years, the offspring that survived tend to have a much thicker beak. They would literally catch them and measure them. And on wet years, it would go down. Okay, because if you have a lot of rain, that softens the seeds, makes it easier for things to crack them open. And these are the averages they took of all the measurements. So in a drought year, all the ones with thin beaks tended to starve to death and die. In the wet years, more would survive. And you can just follow this, the average beak depth, based on whether it's a dry year or a wet year. Let's see. Natural selection molds evolution. We have animals that have this cryptic camouflage, and it helps them to blend in with the background. So how did something like this occur? Well, it probably had some mutations that made it look green, and then over time there were some other shape mutations, and eventually as it concentrated living on one type of plant, and these mutations continued to accrue over time, the ones that looked the most like the leaves on the plant would survive, and the ones who didn't wouldn't. They would get eaten. If you want to see natural selection in action, you can do it every summer in your yard. Go out at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of the summer to your yard and pick up 20 of the little dandelions and pick 20 of these little seed-bearing, fruit-bearing dandelion plants. What will happen as you mow your lawn, the dandelion flowers that are very tall will get cut off, and they will never never develop into this fruit. And these fruits have seeds, and those seeds fly out and land and grow new dandelion plants. So if you every 4 weeks during the summer measure your dandelions, and you'll see that over the course of the summer they will get the average height will go down in your yard. Now, the ones that then when they develop into this fruit-bearing structure, the ones that are tallest, they will increase in height. And the reason for that is a lawnmower cuts one of these and shoots all these little fruits everywhere, which land and grow into new dandelion plants. And so the dandelion plants that produce the tallest ones have a selective advantage. You'll see an increase in the height of these fruit-bearing dandelions. Another natural selection, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, we use way too many antibiotics, and it is starting to become a problem because in addition to using too many too frequently, we also don't tend to finish them. So if you get sick, you get an antibiotic, and it's a 30-day or a 60-day supply. In 45 or 50 days, you feel better and you stop taking them. So what you've done is strengthen the bacteria. Now, the weakest bacteria get killed off by the antibiotic. And then over a course of time, the majority of the bacteria get killed, but the toughest ones, the ones that are most resistant, survive. They need that whole 60 days to kill them. But we stop taking them at 50. And so then that small percentage that can survive the antibiotic for 50 days, they're the ones that now reproduce and spread to the next generation. And so we have developed antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which makes us constantly have to come up with new sources of antibiotics. And then you can put that on top of, in hospitals, they keep everything super clean. They try to keep it as sterile as they possibly can. And that's a tough environment to survive. But the ones that do, because there's always a few that can, and then they reproduce, that's where we've developed a lot of our really bad ones, including some of the antibiotic-resistant staph infections, MRSA as they call it. Evolution never stops. All right? Environmental conditions change. Adaptations that seem perfect in one environment would be completely wrong in another. This is a orchid and its wasp pollinator, and they have evolved alongside each other for a long time. The orchid doesn't evolve in order to be better pollinated by the wasp. Neither the orchid nor the natural selection has foresight. Instead, the orchids best suited to wasp pollination are the most likely to reproduce, so their alleles get passed to the next generation. All right, we'll be going to part 3